Hello, my name is Mary Kidd and I'm Director of the Saltire Society. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth of the Saltire Sessions, a new series of online discussions with the creators and thinkers shaping the cultural landscape of Scotland today. We hope these conversations will offer you food for thought, signpost you to new and thought-provoking books, events and other cultural activity, and perhaps inspire you in your own creative pursuits. Each is designed to slot into a lunch break or a similar time in your day. Today, it is my very great pleasure to be speaking with Billy Kay. For many folk listening, Billy will need very little introduction. His voice and his words have reached millions of people across Scotland and further afield on radio, on screen, on stage, and on the page. Billy was born in Galston in East Ayrshire, studied English at Edinburgh University, and moved to North East Fife, just across the Tay from Dundee, where he bides to this day. His early career was as a broadcaster, and he brought the voices of working men and women across Scotland to the airwaves with Odyssey and later the voice drama Jit. His other plays include Lucky Strike, and his books include the iconic Scots, The Mither Tongue, and of course his autobiography, Born in Kyle, which is written in Scots. He's an internationalist with an interest in languages and combines this with his work to champion Scots and Scotland through an interest in the Scottish diaspora, which is the subject of his book, The Scottish World. Billy has won a raft of awards for his work, including the Sloan Prize, a Heritage Society Award, and Scots Media Person of the Year. We're going to dig into all of these amazing things that Billy has done today. Thank you for joining us, Billy. How are you today?
I'm grand, thanks, and thanks for that lovely introduction.
Oh, thank you for all the wonderful things that you've done, which we're going to explore. I'd like, if it's all right, to start right at the beginning. You grew up, as I said, in East Ayrshire. You studied languages at school and you went to university, I think, originally to study languages, but you made a switch into English literature and language. I wanted to ask, what drew you to that? And maybe when we're talking about this, do you think Scotland takes enough of an interest in languages, its own and other people's? And are we good at it?
I think we were very good at it at one time. I think that the Scots, up until certainly until the Union, the Union created openings for Scots in the English stroke British Empire, but it closed off older trade routes that we were used to. And those older trade routes, you had to be multilingual. The trade routes to the Baltic and to Poland and Prussia and Russia. So Scots in the 17th century, Scots tradespeople would have spoken Scots, they would have been able to communicate with the English, they would have spoken German and Dutch and Polish. A good example of that, there's a great organisation called Die Schottische Bruderschaft, the Scots Brotherhood, which existed in 12 cities across Germany and Poland in the 17th century. And their records were in Scots, German, and Polish. And their membership would have been fluent in all of these languages. So I've always been fascinated by that strong linguistic background. I think we would have been a bit like the Dutch are today. Because they speak a language that not many people speak, Scots or Gaelic, then they used various lingua francae to communicate with the world. And they realised that's what they had to do. And I think Scots in the past were a bit like that. And some brilliant examples that are in the Scottish world. A Scottish missionary, Henry Brunton, was in Sierra Leone in the 1790s. And I think he created the first dictionary of the Susu language, one of the languages of Sierra Leone. 40 years later, he was in the Caucasus working on the Tatar Turkish language. And again, one of the pioneers in writing that down and creating a dictionary of it. And he had that desire of Scots to communicate with the world, but often to communicate with the world, but to be confident in their own culture at the same time. So that's the kind of background I'm attracted to. Going back to why I got into it, I grew up bilingual, simple as that. I grew up fully bilingual in Scots, which was spoke 90% of the time. And I say in the mother tongue that you learned very early at that in the 1950s to become bilingual in English because you might have got the belt for speaking Scots in the classroom. So it's a bizarre situation. But being good at languages from a very early age, because of being bilingual in Scots and English, I found it comparatively easy to learn French and German at high school. And then I went to Kilmarnock Academy, and I was so good at languages and so poor at mathematics, for example, they allowed me to drop maths and to take up Russian at Kilmarnock Academy. So that was what I imbibed as a young boy. And my wife was a teacher of modern languages in Dundee for a while, retired now. And I know how difficult it is to engage young Scots today in modern languages. They don't see the relevance of it. Well, I would have been the opposite of that. I was ganting to learn modern languages. I was up for it. And the similarity in the likes of German and Scots made me think, oh, this is adorable, you know, die Tochter milchte die Kuh, the Dochter malt the Kuh in German and Scots. So I was aware, linguistically aware, and hypersensitive to languages from a very early age. And at university, I went to university because I was good at languages, and you got a full grant at that time, even though you were from a working class background, from a scheme in Goston, you got a full grant. So I was able to be the first person to go to university. And there's one incident I vividly remember of round about that time, of seeing the great actor Peter Ustinov on television being interviewed. And Ustinov spoke several languages. And the interviewer said he was very impressed by this, that he speaks 6 or 7 languages. And Ustinov said something that went straight to my soul at the time, which was, yes, it's all very well speaking 6 or 7 languages, but many of the people I know who speak 6 or 7 languages don't have anything of interest to say in any of them. In other words, it got to me that because there was I, vaunty and prude, that I could fluently speak French and German at that time, but I knew hee-haw about my own culture, about my history, about my literature, out with the Burns tradition, because I grew up imbibing that in a working class Ayrshire background at that time. Burns's songs were sung all around us. But I didn't know my history, my literature, my cultural history. And I determined, as I get more and more interested in that, read more and more, that that was where I wanted to go. So I switched from modern languages after a year of doing French and German to doing, it's called English literature, but it was the Scottish literature I was attracted to. So I did mainly Scottish and American literature within that degree. And I did 2 years of studying Scots, and then I did my final honours in Scots as well. So I had a great academic background in Scots. And it was that combination of discovering the wealth in my culture going back centuries. It wasn't just Burns, it wasn't just a local patois, it was something with a pedigree going literally back 1,000 years that gave me the Ayrshire crusading zeal, covenanting zeal to tell folk what they'd missed out on. And that's what I've been trying to do ever since.
That's brilliant. It's lovely for me to hear because I did much the same thing, Billy. I started off studying French and decided that actually what I wanted to study was Celtic studies, which is, it was Gaelic I wanted to study.
Yes,
Celtic it's called. And
yes,
and I think for a similar reasons, I think it's good to know where you come from first, isn't it?
yes.
Um, so you got that covenanting zeal, a lovely way to put it, and you became first in your professional life a broadcaster. Will you tell us a wee bit about how you broke into that? A career, I think, for a lot of people that seems quite something that you might not really know how that works. And what was it like doing that when you came out of university back then?
Well, I spent a year traveling around the world after university. I worked in the oil rigs and then I spent a year traveling. I continued that all my life, my interest in traveling. I started hitchhiking in France and Germany when I was 15 and traveled every summer. And then the year of 75, I spent traveling right around the world and came back in 76. And as a fail safe, I did a Murray House teacher training just in case. I always wanted to get into broadcasting, and I applied to the BBC, and I didn't get a couple of jobs, but I got the word that they were very interested in me, and a job came up in talks and features as a researcher, and with the arrogance of youth, I did the interview. And then I rejected it because I decided I would go and join the Tartan Army in Argentina at that time. Unfortunately, I had a rethink about that and thought, Billy, you might not get this opportunity again. So I went back and the job was still open. They hadn't re-advertised it. So I joined as a researcher in the Talks and Features department in Queen Street in Edinburgh and began realizing that the people I came from didn't have a voice. There was very little working class history and oral history, and very little Scottish studies and history at that time on the BBC. So I proposed ideas to them. I remember one of the first things I did was a program about the brass band movement because both my dad and my sister were in the silver band, Gossenborough Band. So I did a program about that, and I did interviews with people for a program called 12 Noon, within which it was a kind of magazine type program, and I did interviews with. I remember one of them through my dad's work in Massey Ferguson in Kilmarnock. I interviewed an old man who was from a family of poachers in the Kilmores and Stewarton area. And I interviewed the patriarch. The son worked in Massey's. That's how I got the contact. But I interviewed the patriarch. And amazingly, I've always identified with that working class, radical, very Scottish tradition. And the first thing that this old gentleman wanted down on the tape was, I've poached every water in Scotland, son, even the Queen's waters in Balmoral tea. That's what he wanted recorded on his tape, that he had poached salmon in Balmoral. So I thought, wow, this is amazing material, kind of material you weren't hearing very much of. So that eventually led me to propose the Odyssey series. And the BBC took that on, and I became a producer on short-term contracts in the early 1980s. And I produced 4 series of Odyssey and 2 books based on it that I edited. And they were quite a revelation, again, because it was the first time really people had access to working class history written down, transcribed. And it was an amazing range of programs that I was able to do, on Dundee jute spinners to the last inhabitants of St Kilda. I interviewed some of them, to Ayrshire weavers from the Irvine Valley, to Angus ploughmen, to Lanarkshire Lithuanians, because the ethnic thing I was very interested in. When I did a school trip to Russia when I was 17, on the boat were Lanarkshire Lithuanians. First time I knew of such a thing. And I went back and did an Odyssey program on them, on Glasgow Jewry, on the Scots Italians, on the Ayrshire Spaniards, etc., etc. So I've always been interested in Scotland as a multicultural, multi-ethnic community and a multilingual community. So I've always been interested in all of these things. And Scots links abroad and foreign links within here in Scotland with that migrant tradition. Yeah.
Brilliant. And obviously, we're all delighted that that's what you did. Did you ever regret not going to Argentina with the Tartan Army?
No.
Glad to hear
No,
it.
I didn't. I didn't. And I was able to still go later on in Spain in 82 and Mexico in 86. And I think I'll be back in the States next year. So this
Well,
year. Yeah.
so what's for you, I'll no go by you, as
Aye,
we say.
exactly.
Exactly. But hearing you talk there about your experiences at the BBC and the sort of programme content that you were making seems like a wee bit of a different era. I think you said to me in an email that it was a bit of a golden age.
Yeah.
And recently, there's been a bit of controversy, I suppose we could say, around some programming decisions at BBC Scotland, cutting, for example, some of the late night programmes that have been a really important development space for musicians.
Mhm.
And that sort of, there's a definite feeling that things are tough. Um, and I wondered how you read things today in terms of the health of broadcasting in Scotland and how optimistic you are for the future.
It's there's been a slow decline in the intelligent content and the Scottish content in the BBC. When I was working around the BBC and I became a freelance in the after 1984 and then an independent production company when the BBC hired out programs. So I continued to work for them, but I continued to remind them that their remit in the BBC Charter was to reflect Scottish culture. And if they didn't do that, they were not fulfilling their charter. And that is still the case today. But it takes people in power in the BBC to recognise that and to insist that that continues. I had a patron called Stuart Cohen, great poet, originally from Ayrshire, but who lived in Edinburgh and wrote a lot of great poetry about Edinburgh, still alive. And Stuart took me under his wing as part of the drama department because he knew the power of what I was doing in these Odyssey programs. And I mean, a few years later, Stuart retired out of the BBC, prematurely probably, because I think he couldn't be bothered fighting his corner when it was getting harder and harder to get money allocated to produce drama. I think there still is a wee bit done, but it's all done for Radio 4 UK, and that has implications on linguistically, for example. If Radio 4 is commissioning it, they're not going to use much Scots, for example, because they insist that it has to be for UK consumption. So to me, it was a kind of ordered decline in the content. And there's a lot of what I call yap radio around nowadays. And it's cheap. It's just one person, usually with music, yapping. And folk will phone in and they'll yap. And sometimes you get some serious discussions, but mainly not. It's mainly yap radio. And it's a tragedy. And as I say, it's against the BBC Charter because they should be fulfilling their destiny and doing that. And throughout the years, several times they produced wonderful series on Scottish culture, but it's a sporadic thing, whereas it should be constant. I mean, one wee thing as a Gaelic speaker, to me, it's a pity that the Gaelic television service doesn't do more bilingual programmes in Scots and Gaelic. For example, one of the great successes is Na Trads, the traditional music show that they do, which has Marianne Kennedy and Ali Heather presenting it in Scots and in Gaelic. And to me, it's a wonderful example of what should be a common thing, that there should be programmes on the history of the other major language, Scots, within that too. So there's a lot. I mean, it's a huge subject for debate, but basically, Scotland is ill-served by broadcasting. Smaller countries that don't have a nation state behind them, like Catalonia and Galicia in Spain, have a lot better broadcasting services using the native languages than we do. And that should not be the case.
Yeah, there has been some discussion you might have seen in Westminster about perhaps a discrepancy or disparity between the funding for Yspadric in Wales, S4C, and BBC Alaba, and that's before we discuss, as you say, the allowance for Scots. And of course, charter renewal is a hot button topic, but really interesting there to hear. And from my perspective, to think about those sort of programs that you were making, that does seem like a bit of a different world,
Yes.
and something that we miss. Stuart Conn received a Saltire Society Fletcher of Saltoun Award, recognising his work in December last year.
Great.
And so it was
Great.
marvellous to meet him and get to
Yes.
hear a little bit about some of that work. That brings us on maybe to talk a wee bit about Scots, because you are known, perhaps best known, as a champion of the Scots language. And of course, your book, The Mother Tongue, and its adaptation was such a big influence on lots of people in Scotland in terms of how they view the language. And you've told us a wee bit about perhaps the genesis of the book in Odyssey and other work, but what led to that? What made you do that? Pick up that pen?
Arguing at dinner parties for many years to try and tell people the richness of what they had, what was behind the English that they spoke. Behind that was this great literary language going back centuries, arguably the greatest literature in Europe between about 1450 and 1550 was written in Scots with the Makars. So it was discussions, because most people were totally ignorant about it. They just presumed it was a kind of obscure working class patois. They had no knowledge of that history going back 1,000 years, no knowledge of the literary tradition, and just thought it was something that should be dismissed as totally irrelevant to them in the 20th or the 20th century or the 21st century. So it was the desire to tell people what they had missed out on. Because what I find is when I give talks on the subject, and I've spent my life going around Scotland talking about this, is that people are just basically astonished, and then B, fascinated of the linguistic history that they've got. I studied Molière in French, and there's one of his great plays is The Bourgeois Gentilhomme, where Monsieur Jourdain is explained the differences between prose and poetry. And he suddenly says, God, I've been speaking prose all my life and I had no idea I was doing it. Well, a lot of people are that way with Scots. They suddenly realise, God, my mum and dad spoke that, my granny spoke that, and there's got this pedigree, and yet I know nothing about it, and I've got the remnant of it. So there's a desire to reacquaint yourself if you do hear or discover the true history. So I've converted a lot of people in the work that I've done with the radio programs, with the books, and with the audiobooks. I've done audiobooks of The Mother Tongue and Born in Kyle. And they're great for people who are trying to learn the language, because they've got me narrating them, and they can tune in. If they're foreigners wanting to learn Scots, they can tune in that way.
I wonder if that might be an opportunity to ask you to give us a wee reading from, I think it's Born in Kyle you're going to give us a wee reading from.
It's Born in Kyle, and while I get the book, I took this off my bookshelf to show you. This was something I was given from, I can't remember which branch of the Saltire Society, but I addressed them. I've spoken in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Helensburgh, so it would be one of them that gave me a present of that plaque there, which I have in my shelf. But this is a short passage on the everyday words that we used in Scots in my house in the 1950s. A moger was when Othin was tap Saltire and out a kilter. A clipe was a buddy hotel Tony a hint your back. A gomerel was an idiot. A bachel was a wee roon buddy with no an yuch such to sprachel out a shach. A muckle sumph was a boy that was challenging the mater of hands. It didn't have muckle chance of getting on it were a cause of that. A lang stond was what a daft boy just starting a new job of work was sent to ask for. A gleg wane was when there was alert to life and all its possibilities. Hullicket meant somebody that was kind of muckle, clumsy, and awkward in their movements. A sleeket wee nyaff was a toty wee stunted buddy that was devious in the way he treated folk. Trig was used to describe a wheel-turned-out lassie, and warsel was used to describe when life was a chav or a struggle, and you had to warsel or wrestle with all things confronting you. It literally was your mother stung as a bairn, and she looked after me and my sisters Mary and Jeanette with grooming words and expressions like, "Gie that face of yours a dick with a clout," or "Come here to gie your lugs a good wash, you could plant tatties in them." There's just a puckle for half the tap in my head, but I'm sure I could easily give you page after page of second words and no have to think that long about them. That's just the way it was. So that was the depth of the linguistic experience ilka day in life when I was a wee boy.
That's lovely. Thank you for reading that. And it's just got a richness and a kind of music
Yes.
that's it's wonderful to hear. And I wonder if I could ask you about the idea of Scots on the page. From its earliest times, the Saltire Society believed in making older literature available because it simply wasn't when the society was founded in the 30s, and they really believed that the Scottish cultural inheritance might not survive. And in a sense, I reflect myself on, I was, I suppose, really growing as a reader in the 1990s, and Canongate were issuing the Canongate classics for adults. So lots of older work, lots of older modern, but also older work like David Lindsay's work was coming back into print. They were issuing the Kelpies for children. So books like Fankle the Cat, the George Mackay Brown was appearing. And recently I heard a poet who writes in an indigenous language in Mexico say that one of the challenges that faces any smaller language is not having access to the privilege of the press. That there's a power to having that work in print. Now, it seems to me that we've slightly taken some steps backwards, that we had a bit of progress and there was a lot available, and we're sort of coming back the way again. So I wanted to ask you, I know it's a kind of multi-part question, how important is it that all of that older literature, and especially literature in Scots, is available in print? And where do you think we're at with all of that?
I think that in general, people are more aware now of that great literary tradition and linguistic tradition. I've got some of those. When I studied literature, Scottish literature in the early 1970s, is that right? In Edinburgh, a lot of the Makars series was published by the Saltire Society, so I've still got them in my bookshelf, and I just loved coming across them. They were just a revelation. But I'm finding that one of the experiences of publishing Born in Kyle was the resistance to it. Things in Scots, and I'm sure the Gaels have that problem too, of people deciding that they can't be bothered stocking something in an Indigenous language because they think that no one will be interested in that. I mean, I had an experience at one book festival where I asked if they would stock the book, hoping they would stock it permanently in a locality. I'll not name names, but they said they wouldn't. They didn't have room in the bookshop for all of the people appearing in the book festival, so they wouldn't stock it, but they would sell it at the event. And I was annoyed at that because I'd rather, if they're not prepared to stock it and promote it, then I'd rather sell it myself at the book gigs. So I ended up, they sold my book at the event, and it was the best-selling book at the book festival. And afterwards, I thought, well, you'd think they would ask if they could stock it. No interest whatsoever in stocking it, because they would have to deal with a small publisher, and they just couldn't be bothered. So there's something about promoting a work in an indigenous language. Maybe we need some support to insist that there should be a quota or something like that, to make these books available. Having said that, one of the reasons I was going to write that book anyway, a memoir of growing up in the 50s and 60s, but I would have produced it on Kindle Direct, and which would have been fine. But because the Scottish Government has a grant for publication in Scots, I applied for that and I was able to get that. And the result is it's a beautiful production, beautifully designed, etc., etc. So some things are great, are an advance in Scots in recent years, but there still is, people will not come out and say that it's an irrelevance and we should be speaking, be internationalists in outlook. But there still is an old kind of colonial remnant of the attitude against Indigenous languages. That was shown in the mother tongue. In one of the early chapters, that last edition was published about 2006. And I spoke about the debate around having a census question in Scots. And was it 2001? People ridiculed the idea of a census question in Scots. By 2010, everyone passed it in the Parliament. So big changes have happened in the mentality. And the people who were previously against it would hold their peace nowadays, because they would be exposed as being ignoramuses if they went against it. But that old colonial, culturally colonized mentality, I'm afraid, exists in certain sections of the society, and maybe will exist as long as the status of the Indigenous culture is under debate. It should not be under debate. And that might need political change for that to change dramatically.
It's really interesting hearing you speak there, Billy, and some of what you're saying. It's such a big and complicated picture. You've got a sort of picture of issues around confidence, which maybe, some of those spring from, as I say, that idea of the privilege of the press. Once you exclude a language from print or from education or the other contexts that confer statuses on languages, they become almost sort of private sphere languages, and then it's easy to dismiss them.
Yes.
But that's now coming up against a scenario in which globalization and conglomeration are threatening, even languages that are the absolute majority language of their country, but smaller countries like Iceland are worrying about the future of the language, while, the sort of global American kind of, if you like, the digital world is starting to sort of break down access. So something that one would say, you mentioned the Kindle option of publishing there, things that theoretically could make it easier can also make it harder, because it's sort of pushing, I suppose, a new kind of linguistic imperialism.
Yes,
Which is
yes.
that the big global languages are almost taking all before them. Do you see it as, are we on a trajectory where we're sort of winning and it's steady, or is it a case of kind of almost every generation having to find the thing anew and make the discovery anew and acquaint themselves anew? How do you see us? How do you see the situation of Scots now?
I think it's it's. I mean, I've observed in my own lifetime the erosion of the vocabulary. My grandmother had a much richer Scots vocabulary than my parents did, but the richness of that you've just heard was phenomenal compared to a lot of people today. But the structure of the language is still there. People still speak dialects of Scots, and the easiest thing to learn in a language is the words. Learning French and German and Russian when I was a teenager, I learned, 1,000 new words in those languages. So imagine if they were Scots words, 1,000 new Scots words, even 100 new Scots words could become embedded in the culture very, very quickly if they were broadcast regularly and if they were celebrated in the press regularly. And the other thing is, social media tends to be more colloquial than traditional letter writing, for example. So people speak more colloquially in social media and on TikTok, etc., than they did in the past. So that's a positive thing. That loosening up of the kind of rigidity of speaking, say, standard English all the time. So these things are happening, but at the same time, yes, globalization. But I don't know. I'm very confident in the power of Scottish culture and the power of Scottish literature. Having travelled the world a lot, I see loads of influences of that around the world. And the positive legacy that Scots have left in the world means that people in far-flung countries view the Scots sympathetically. So that's a very positive thing that I experienced as a Scot travelling the world and having written a book about the diaspora. So we've got that on our side. It may take political change, though, from my perspective, that's the way I see it, to fulfill all of that and to become a normal country. Some people would disagree with that. But that's another aspect that I find very interesting. I think in the past that writers like Walter Scott and John Buchan could be confident, they could be confident in their unionism, but they could be confident Scottish cultural patriots at the same time. I think that class of people has almost died a death. I don't know anybody of the younger generation from that political side of things who represent that strong cultural patriotic tradition of Scottish unionism that definitely existed in my day. I knew a few old families who were high Tories and who were still Scottish patriots. And politically, they might have been against Scottish nationalism, but their prime identity was the Scottish identity. But today, I think the polarisation has resulted in the younger generation of, I'm afraid, a lot of unionists fearing and despising the culture, Scottish culture, rather than celebrating it the way some of their fellow unionist brethren did in the past. So that's a big change that I've noticed in Scottish society gradually throughout my lifetime.
Maybe it's also an interesting kind of call to make sure that in celebrating different and new kind of diversities in Scottish literature, we also don't forget that foundational group of writers who include folk like Scott, who can be seen, I think, today as difficult to read. But I think until you've picked up Red Gauntlet, you can't tell me it's difficult to read.
Yes. Funnily enough, I'm rereading that just now.
Oh, it's
Red Gauntlet. And I loved it. My favourite is Old Mortality, because it begins in Upper Clydesdale, near the Irvine Valley where I come from, just over into Lanarkshire. And I'll tell you a wee story about that. When I read that at university, it begins by describing a Wappenshaw, a muster of arms in Upper Clydesdale during the killing times of the Covenanters. And when I came across that word, because I'm a German speaker, I immediately saw Wappenshaw, Waffenschau, a muster of arms, pure Germanic word in Scots. And I thought, what a pity that word has died a death. I wish we still had Wappenshaws. And cut to about 20 years later, and I'm first footing some of my many K relatives in Galston. And I'm first footing Uncle Albert, and I asked him what he was going to be doing in the next few days. And he says, me and Margaret are awa orty soaring for a Wappenshaw tomorrow. And I said, you're what? We're awa orty soaring for a Wappenshaw. Wappenshaw is used today to describe a competition between bulling clubs in the west of Scotland. They're having a Wappenshaw against one another. So I call this my Wappenshaw theory, that every word that's ever existed in Scots exists somewhere.
That's
Even words from Dunbar and Henryson exist somewhere in somebody's mouth somewhere and is still used in some family or some wee village or whatever. So there's a story about Wappenshaw.
oh, I love it. I love it. Well, that's us got our social media clip as well for this. That's absolutely brilliant. Well, you've spoken a wee bit about the diaspora, and I think when folk think about the Scottish diaspora, they very quickly think about America and Canada, Tartan Week in New York, and perhaps Australia and New Zealand. But the diaspora that you're talking about is very much broader, isn't it? And it goes back centuries to all sorts of parts of the world. Can you tell us a wee bit about that and about the things that you've discovered?
I'd love to, because I find before I do that, just one wee clip. You mentioned America, and one of the proudest occasions I had was when the Saltire, sorry, not the Saltire Society, the St Andrews Society of the state of New York gave me their Mark Twain Award, and I was able to address the society about 5 years ago, and it was the Mark Twain Award because Mark Twain had addressed the society at the turn of the 20th century, being invited by Andrew Carnegie. And that was a wonderful thing about that modern diaspora that I experienced. But the older diaspora, the Scots in Poland and Prussia and the Baltic, is absolutely fascinating. It's reckoned that William Lithgow, one of our early travel writers, described 60,000 Scots living in Poland in a period when he was there in the 17th century. And there were a mixture of, and the title of my radio series was Merchants, Peddlers, Mercenaries. And that's what they mainly were. Soldiers of fortune, people like Patrick Gordon, who went to the second-hand man, Patrick Gordon was the son of an aristocratic family from the northeast, who went first to Poland and Prussia and then became Peter the Great's right-hand man in Russia and wrote a 6-volume history of Russia, which is still one of the main texts of Russia today. Another person from that diaspora was a man called Lermonth from Fife. I think it was Peter Lermonth from memory, and he fought for the Poles, was captured by the Russians, and when he was released by the Russians, became a Russian citizen, and eventually his Scottish name of Lermonth became the Russian name of Lermontov. And the great Russian romantic poet Lermontov is a descendant from one of these Scottish soldiers of fortune. And a wee connection, a descendant of his mother's side, he died when he was young, Lermontov, but his mother's family continued. And a descendant of his mother's side of the family, a young woman called Marie Korolyeva, teaches Scottish Gaelic in Moscow. So there's a connection with Lermontov, with soldiers of fortune, and the survival of Gaelic being taught in Moscow. So that's an example of the fascinating material that I've managed to uncover. And they took one of the main reasons for that, and one of the great traditions of Scotland that I'm very proud of, is the tradition of what George Elder Davy, a man from Dundee who wrote a wonderful book called The Democratic Intellect. And the democratic intellect was about the broad-based education that Scots were given, many subjects rather than the specialist English tradition, and the broad-based access to it by working class people, by poorer folk, people going to university who in other places in the world never go to university because of that tradition, which survives in the fact that we don't pay fees today in Scottish universities. So they created this ladder pairts tradition of people going abroad who had basic education. And in a time when, for example, in Poland, the peasantry couldn't read or write, what an advantage it gave people. And that's why they settled down and made a huge impact in all the countries they settled in. So philosophers called John Johnston in Poland. I mean, a great example is Scandinavia in Norway, where three of the greatest Norwegians, Edvard Grieg, the composer, W.F.K. Christie, the statesman, and Peter Dass, the poet, the Gothic poet and hymn writer, son of Peter Dundas from Dundee, all part of that Scottish diaspora, where as educated people, we had a huge advantage over countries where mass education and mass literacy was regarded as highly dangerous and dubious. And there's a wonderful quote about that. I did a series for the BBC on that called The Democratic Intellect. And there's a wonderful quote in the Scottish World that's based on that, where as late as the 1820s, people were arguing in the British Parliament that it was dangerous for the working class to be able to read and write. So what, I mean, so therefore, when you say things like, oh, the Scots were uncivilized and we got all of our civilization from our neighbours down the road, I just laugh at that because it's so ludicrous given that tradition, going back at least as far as the Reformation, but probably before that. I mean, Lord Byron prided himself in having sat beside a suitor or a cobbler in the Aberdeenshire schools that he grew up in. He was aware of that problem that the English had with class and with hierarchy. But he, you know, he said, I am half a Scot by birth and bred a whole one, and my heart flies to my head in Don Juan. He was proud of that democratic intellect tradition that he had inherited in Aberdeenshire.
That's brilliant. Just hearing the richness and the wealth of knowledge that you have. And I could ask you about 10 other questions, but things you touched on there. And I'm not going to do it today because we don't have time, but I'm hoping that maybe we can. I'd be especially interested in talking to you a wee bit about more sometime about the lad of Pearts and indeed the lasses of Pearts,
Yes.
and kind of how that is playing out in modern Scotland, perhaps. And some of the politics of that. But that will be a conversation for another day. I do want to touch on something that you've kind of, in speaking about that breadth of engagement with the world, folk coming in, folk going out, trade ships coming in, trade ships going out. One of the things that came to Scotland was wine, and that's a passion that you have. And I wanted to ask you a wee bit about that because you've written and indeed broadcast and been on stage talking about good claret wine. Can I ask you a wee bit about that? Is that an interest that you still maintain?
I do. I've run a wine tasting group in Newport in Northeast Fife since I arrived here in 1988. And I had one in Edinburgh before I left Edinburgh. But I continue maybe 6 times a year with wine tastings. And I give talks on the wine tradition. My favourite evenings, and I did one recently in a restaurant, Stravagan in Glasgow, where Business for Scotland invited some of their patrons, some of the people who donate to them, for an evening where we married very fine food and fine wine with a Scottish historic context. Sauvignon Blanc with a starter with the fish course, claret with the main course, and a Scottish port to end up with. The port firms like Coburn and Graham and Sandeman, for example, were all Scottish port firms. So I love doing that. And to me, it's the great untapped. I'm so disappointed when Food and Drink Scotland don't use this tradition more, because we don't produce wine ourselves. So you need, if you're producing fine food, you need to have wine with it. And there are all these wines with historic Scottish connections going back hundreds of years, summed up in a peeved Elizabethan Englishman's response to the fact that the Scots were getting privileges in the wine trade in France because of the Old Alliance. And he says something like, because he, the Scot, hath always been a useful confederate to France against England, he hath right of preemption or first choice of wines in Bordeaux. The result of that was the English ships had to put to the citadel of Bly, were subject to curfews, etc., had to pay higher taxes. The Scots, as a friendly nation, got straight up the river to get the new pick of the Vendanges. And that tradition lasted through even beyond the Union, where people smuggled in good claret. They might now be British, but they weren't going to accept the English's view of claret as being French, therefore anti-British. The Scots continued to bring in claret and continued it through the Jacobite period. Claret in beautifully wrought glass, those glasses with the stems with the spirals, with Fiat or the White Rose or the Jacobite Rose on it. They continued to toast the King o'er the water in Gid claret best keeps through the cold and drives awa the winter soon. It makes a man both gash and bald and heaves his soul beyond the moon. Let this day come as it thinks fit, the present minute's only ours. On pleasure, let's employ our wit and laugh at fortune's feckless poors. And that's an Alan Ramsay poem from the 18th century, which was one of the heights of the claret drinking period. And there's great chapters in the book, which I wrote with Callan MacLean. And the fact that a Gael from the Highlands and a Lowlander with Scots who both spoke French meant that we got wonderful material for that book that a lot of people wouldn't have been able to access. But having Gaelic, Scots and French, both of us, meant that it was a much richer book than would otherwise have been the case. And it's still a subject, as I say, that fascinates me and I thoroughly enjoy talking about.
Oh, well, I hope someday, I get to come along to one of your wine tasting evenings. That sounds absolutely wonderful. And a really nice note to bring our conversation to a close, which I'm very sorry to do. I think we could have spoken on for quite a while, but really inspiring to think about not only the challenges that face us, but all of the riches of the culture and of the language and of the history and all of the gems that are there for folk to discover. So I do hope that anybody listening will pick up one of Billy's books, maybe even have a look back and see if you can find some of those brilliant programmes and have a watch, and maybe have a watch or a read with a glass of something nice. And we'll say a cheers to you, Billy, for that. Thank you so much. That's been an absolute pleasure. This discussion has been hosted by the Saltire Society. We've discussed it a few times in some of its programmes. We're a membership organisation founded in 1936 with the express purpose of championing the cultural life of Scotland. In 9 decades, we've delivered a vast array of programme across a vast range of cultural contexts, responding to and shaping some of the major social and cultural trends in post-war Scotland. The situation of Scottish culture today is unrecognisable from the situation then, but as we've touched on, that things change, things come in circles and cycles, and there are still challenges. And we hope that if you've enjoyed the conversation and the other conversations in this series, you might consider joining us, standing with other people who believe in Scottish culture. And you can find a link below. We'll also drop in links to Billy's work and his books. And that just leaves me to say thank you so much, Billy. That's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
A great pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.